Have you ever hated something about yourself so much that you started wishing you could trade lives with someone else? Like you wake up every day wishing you were anybody but you. That's how I used to feel every single day. I used to stare at myself in the mirror and think, why did I have to be born like this? And even though people told me I was fine the way I was, deep down, I didn't believe it. I hated who I was, not because I was a bad person, but because I kept comparing myself to everyone else. And that comparison slowly destroyed me from the inside. But what I didn't realize back then was that what I thought was my curse was actually my greatest gift. It just took losing everything and almost losing myself to finally see it. So tell me honestly, if you were in my shoes, would you have made the same mistake I did? Growing up, I was never the fast one. Not in school, not in sports, not in life. I was the kind of kid who always finished last in the race, who struggled to keep up, who never got picked first for teams. My friends used to joke that I was like a tortoise, slow, quiet, steady, but boring. And you know what? I used to laugh along with them, pretending I didn't care. But inside, those words hurt. They stuck. They built a wall of insecurity around me that grew taller every year. My parents tried to tell me that I had my own strengths, that I was thoughtful, patient, observant. But when you're a kid surrounded by people who seem to shine brighter, it's hard to believe that slow and steady could ever win any race. I remember one day in school, I was maybe 12, and we had this sprint race during sports day. Everyone was excited, and even though I knew I wasn't fast, I wanted to try. I wanted to prove that I could be like them, that maybe for once I could be the one who crossed the line first. The whistle blew, and everyone shot forward like rockets. I gave it everything I had. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I ran. Still, by the time I reached the finish line, everyone was already clapping for the winners. I came in dead last. I still remember standing there, panting, staring at their smiling faces and feeling something inside me break. It wasn't just disappointment. It was humiliation. That day, I decided that I never wanted to feel that way again. I wanted to be faster, better, stronger. I wanted to shed that tortoise shell that made me who I was as I grew older. That desire to be someone else grew into an obsession. I started pushing myself beyond my limits. I copied how others walked, talked, dressed, even how they thought. I compared my life with everyone's highlight reel. Social media made it worse. Every time I opened my phone, it felt like a punch to the gut. Everyone seemed to be racing ahead, getting better grades, better jobs, better relationships, and there I was, crawling behind, dragging a shell I didn't want. My best friend, Ethan, was everything I thought I wasn't. Confident, charming, fast-moving. He got promoted at work before me, got into a relationship before me, even got his own apartment before I did. And even though he never rubbed it in my face, I couldn't stop comparing. Every time he told me about his new achievement, a voice inside whispered, "See? You'll never catch up." It was around that time that my life started to spiral. I began working longer hours, skipping meals, sleeping less, trying to outrun my own nature. I convinced myself that the only way to be happy was to be like everyone else. The tortoise in me, the patient, careful, steady part, was dying a slow death. I remember my mom once saying, "Son, a flower doesn't bloom faster just because it's jealous of the one next to it." But I didn't listen. I was too busy chasing after other people's timelines. I thought success had one speed fast, and if I couldn't keep up, I didn't deserve it. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a cold morning in March. I had just been assigned to a massive project at work, something that could finally prove my worth. I was determined to impress everyone, especially my boss. But to do that, I needed to be perfect. Every report, every number, every presentation, I double-checked, then triple-checked. I started coming in early and leaving late, missing dinners, ignoring calls from my family. I told myself it was temporary, that once I made it, I'd rest. But the truth was, I was slowly breaking. I was pushing a boulder up a hill that wasn't even mine to climb. One evening, Ethan dropped by my office. He took one look at me and said, "Dude, you look like you haven't slept in days." I laughed it off, but he didn't. He said, "You don't have to kill yourself to prove something. You're good at what you do. You've always been I brushed him off, pretending to be fine. But that night, after he left, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. My eyes were sunken, my face pale, my hands trembling from exhaustion. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I had become a stranger, someone wearing a mask that didn't fit. A week later, everything fell apart. The project I had been working so hard on was rejected. Not because I didn't try, but because I made a crucial mistake in my calculations. Something I would have caught if I hadn't been so tired and desperate to impress. I remember sitting in that meeting room, hearing my boss say, "We'll have to pull the proposal." The world around me blurred. My throat tightened and I felt my stomach twist. After the meeting, I just sat there in silence while everyone else left. I wanted to scream, cry, disappear, anything. For the first time, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to be someone else, I could never escape who I truly was. I was the tortoise trying to live like a hare, and I had lost everything because of it. For days, I couldn't face anyone. I ignored calls, shut myself in, and drowned in self-hate. I told myself I was worthless, that I didn't belong anywhere, that I was doomed to be slow, left behind, forgotten. But one evening, as I sat alone in the park, something strange happened. I saw a little tortoise crossing the path. It was moving slowly, step by step, dragging its shell. People walked past it, some even laughing at how slow it was. But it didn't stop. It didn't look around or compare itself to anyone. It just kept moving, steady and calm. And for some reason, I couldn't take my eyes off it. I watched that tiny creature for what felt like hours until it finally disappeared into the grass. And then it hit me that tortoise was me. Or rather, it was who I used to be before I started hating myself. The shell it carried wasn't a burden, it was protection. It wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was what made it survive. That moment broke me open in ways I can't describe. I went home that night and cried for hours. Not out of sadness, but out of realization. I had spent my whole life trying to be faster, lighter, better. But in doing so, I'd stripped myself of everything that made me me. The patience, the thoughtfulness, the quiet strength. I had thrown all that away because I thought the world didn't value it. But maybe the problem wasn't that I was too slow. Maybe it was that I was running in the wrong race altogether. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years. Every night, I wrote about what I was feeling, the anger, the fear, the guilt. Slowly, I began to understand that comparison was a poison I had been drinking daily without even realizing it. I thought other people's success meant my failure, but it didn't. We all have different races to run, different paces to keep, different shells to carry. The hare and the tortoise weren't enemies. They were just built differently. And that's okay. Still, the road to self-acceptance wasn't easy. I kept slipping back into old habits, checking social media, measuring my progress against Ethan's, feeling small whenever someone else succeeded. It was like trying to unlearn years of conditioning. One night I called Ethan and finally told him everything, how I'd always compared myself to him, how I'd secretly resented his success. I expected him to be angry, or worse, pity me. But instead, he laughed softly and said, "Man, I always thought you were the one who had it together. You're grounded, calm, and you actually think before you act. I wish I had that." That hit me like a truck. All this time, I'd been envying him for things he envied me for. We were both comparing. It's both blind to our own worth. So that's the situation I was in, standing at a crossroads. Between who I had been and who I wanted to become. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you were me, if you had spent your whole life hating the very things that made you unique, what would you have done? Would you keep trying to change yourself to fit in? Or would you finally learn to accept the shell you were born with? Pause for a second and tell me in the comments. Because what I did next changed everything. After that night, the night I asked myself whether I could ever learn to accept who I was, something in me started to shift. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. For the first time in years, I stopped chasing the next finish line. I stopped trying to catch up. Instead, I began to just D. I wish I could tell you it was easy. That once I had that realization, everything just fell into place. But that's not how it works. The truth is, learning to stop comparing yourself to others is like trying to unlearn a language you've spoken your whole life. Every thought, every instinct wants to go back to that toxic comfort zone where your worth depends on someone else's speed. But I was determined. I had lived too long hating myself to keep doing it. I started small. I deleted most of my social media apps, or at least stopped checking them obsessively. I replaced my compare and scroll time with reading, journaling, and just being alone with my thoughts, something that used to terrify me. When I wasn't distracting myself with other people's lives, I was forced to face my own. And honestly, that silence was uncomfortable at first. It was like meeting a stranger I had been avoiding for years myself. I remember sitting in my room one night, staring at the blank pages of my notebook and asking myself, what do I actually want? Not what looks good, not what other people are doing. What do I really want? And you know what? I didn't have an answer. I had been so busy running someone else's race that I had no idea what my own even looked like. Weeks turned into months. And slowly I began to rebuild. I went back to work, but this time with a different mindset. I stopped volunteering for every project just to prove my worth. I started focusing on quality instead of speed. I took my time, thought things through, asked questions. Some of my colleagues still raced ahead, submitting things quickly and getting quick praise. But I didn't care as much anymore. I reminded myself that I was the tortoise and there was strength in that. My boss noticed the change too. He once told me, "You've become a lot more thoughtful in your approach lately. Keep that up." Okay. And that one sentence, that tiny acknowledgement, felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time, someone saw my slowness not as a flaw, but as a strength. Around that same time, Ethan and I started hanging out again. One weekend, we went hiking, something we used to do back in college. Halfway through the trail, I noticed how fast he was moving ahead while I kept taking breaks, admiring the view, catching my breath. Before, that would have made me feel embarrassed. I would have pushed myself to keep up, ignoring how exhausted I was. But this time, I just smiled and said, "Go on ahead, man. I'll catch up." He laughed and said, "Still the tortoise, huh?" But he didn't say it mockingly. He said it like it was something to be proud of. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being slow meant I got to actually see things others missed. The details. The quiet moments, the beauty in between the rush, as we sat on the top of that hill watching the sunset. Ethan said something that stuck with me. "You know, I used to think the goal in life was to win, to get there first. But the older I get, the more I think it's about just getting there at all, with your peace intact." I nodded, staring at the horizon. "Yeah," I said softly. "I used to think I had to lose my shell to fit in. But now I think it's the only thing that ever protected me." He smiled and said, "Then wear it proudly, my friend." And in that moment, I felt lighter, not because I had finally caught up, but because I had finally stopped running away from myself. A few months later, an opportunity came up at work, a mentorship program where we were supposed to guide new interns. My boss asked if I wanted to join. Old me would have declined, thinking I wasn't good enough to teach anyone. But new me said yes. My mentee was a nervous, quiet kid named Liam who reminded me a lot of myself. He was slow to catch on at first, unsure of himself, always apologizing for not getting it faster. One day he even said, "I'm sorry. I know I'm not as smart as the others." I looked at him and saw the younger version of me, the same self-doubt, the same fear of not being enough. So I told him something that I wish someone had told me years ago. Speed doesn't make you smart. Consistency does. The ones who rush get tired fast, but the ones who take their time build something that lasts. I saw something shift in his eyes that day, the same way it once did in mine. Over the next few months, Liam improved drastically, not because he became faster, but because he stopped comparing himself. He started focusing on learning, not competing. And when he got praised for a project he completed perfectly, Even though it took him twice as long as others, I felt this deep sense of pride. It was like watching my own redemption play out through him. I realized that my story, my pain, had a purpose after all. If I hadn't gone through that endless cycle of comparison and self-hate, I wouldn't have been able to guide someone else out of it. But life, as always, has its way of testing the lessons you claim to have learned. It happened a few months later when Ethan and I applied for the same promotion. The old me would have panicked immediately. That competitive voice in my head, the one that whispered, "He'll get it before you," just like always, started to stir again. For a moment, I felt that familiar sinking feeling in my stomach. The urge to compare, to compete, to measure my worth against his. But then I stopped. I took a deep breath and reminded myself, my race is mine. My pace is mine. If it's meant for me, it won't miss me. So I gave it my best, slow and steady, and left the rest to fate. When the results came in, Ethan got the promotion. And you know what? I smiled. Not out of fake politeness, but genuine happiness. He had worked hard, and he deserved it. And for the first time in my life, someone else's success didn't make me feel smaller. That moment was my real victory. Not the job title, not the paycheck, but the peace that came from finally being okay with where I was. That night, Ethan took me out for dinner to celebrate. He raised his glass and said to the tortoise, who taught me how to slow down. And I laughed so hard that people around us stared. Because in that laughter, there was freedom. The kind I had been chasing for years without knowing it. Months passed, and I continued living life at my own rhythm. I started spending more time with family, taking walks, cooking, journaling, and actually living instead of just existing. I learned that self-love isn't about being proud of your achievements. It's about being kind to yourself when you have none. It's about forgiving yourself for being human. I began volunteering on weekends, mentoring more people who struggled with the same feelings I once did, not being enough. And every time someone told me they felt slow, behind, or stuck, I told them the story of the tortoise who once refused his shell. I told them that the tortoise doesn't win because he's fast. He wins because he never stops. He doesn't carry his shell as a burden. He carries it as a home. And that's what we all need to understand, that your flaws, your pace, your struggles, they're not weights holding you back. They're armor that has kept you safe through life's storms. We live in a world obsessed with comparison, followers, likes, milestones, money. But none of those things define who we are. You can't measure a sunset with a stopwatch. And you can't measure a life with a scoreboard. A year later, something beautiful happened. I got an email from Liam, my old mentee. He said, "I just got promoted today. I couldn't have done it without you." And attached to his message was a photo of a tiny tortoise figurine sitting on his desk. He wrote to remind me to carry my shell with pride. I stared at that photo for a long time and felt tears in my eyes. Because that little tortoise wasn't just his reminder, it was mine too. Proof that sometimes the slowest steps lead to the most meaningful destinations. Looking back now, I realize that every failure, every setback, every moment I felt left behind, it all happened for a reason. I needed to break down to understand what truly mattered. I needed to lose my way to find my pace. And most importantly, I needed to hate myself once to finally learn how to love myself, right? The tortoise in me never needed to change. It just needed to stop hiding. It took me years to realize that my shell, the very thing I once tried to escape, was what made me strong, resilient, and grounded. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt like you're not enough, like you're too slow, too late, too different, I want you to hear this from someone who's been there. Your time is coming. Don't rush it. Don't compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. You're not behind. You're just on your own path. The world doesn't need another hare trying to prove how fast it can run. It needs more tortoises who move with purpose, who endure, who carry their shells proudly, no matter how heavy they feel. Maybe your journey is taking longer because it's meant to. Maybe the things you're learning along the way are preparing you for something that can't be rushed. Every slow step you take is still progress. Every delay is still direction. Every shell you carry is still strength. So don't throw it away just because the world moves faster than you. Remember, the race was never about who got there first. It was always about who kept going. That's my story. The story of the tortoise who refused his shell until he finally realized it was never holding him back. It was holding him together. So, if you are on my side, if you've ever felt like the tortoise in a war,